Okay, good evening. Um, Trying to we're always trying to work on better ways of communicating and better ways of using our online technology. So this is yet another attempt by me. Okay, so what we're talking about this time is moral disagreement. And the basic question that we struggle with is, can you disagree about the resolution of a moral problem? And still, could each of those differences be correct? Or is there just one right answer? Now, if you've gone through the Gert text, you know, I think, what he says about it, but I'm going to try to build his case a little bit. First of all, he says that there are two groups that would always think there were correct answers to every moral question. And those two groups would be the moral realists, and the moral realists would be more like the consequentialists. That is, in remembering consequentialism, it's like if you add up the good versus the bad, or the good versus the evil, you always choose the greatest good because it will turn out that way almost mathematically. Well, we know that cost benefit is not always the best way to resolve a moral question. So it's probably not the most, not the strongest way to weigh good versus evil. I mean, we talk about weighing as though there is a weight difference, but we just cannot agree that this procedure would be the proper one. And certainly, I don't think Gert would agree with it. Now, the other group would be the moral constructivists, and they would be sort of more like the Rawlsians. That is, if you put a group of rational, impartial people together, they will solve the problem because they will do what is necessary to protect their own place or status. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, of course, we know that this is theoretical, but that doesn't mean it's not a good theory, because it still is. But what I'm trying to say is that even if you put a group of thoroughly rational people and thoroughly impartial people together, they still might come up with different answers to moral questions. Now, why is this? Why is this? Now, we know that Gert would talk more in a softer way about this, and not quite as not to say it's not logical, but it's not quite as strong a way. And he would talk about what can we do. What the right answer to a question is always about how we can lessen harms. But there are still, even within the question of lessening harms, there are still questions that seem to be irresolvable. Now, he talks at length about why abortion, in our society at least, is an irresolvable question. The reason that he believes, and I believe this too, by the way, and I think that if you examine all of the literature, if you could examine all of the literature on abortion, what you would find out is that people approach this question of abortion from very, very different worldviews, that their starting points, and remember, in an argument, you always have to have a starting point. You have to have something that you throw out there and say, this is what we're going to work with. That their starting points would be so different. I mean, is abortion a question of rights? I mean, that's a big, sort of idea that we always try to use in resolving the abortion question. But then the question comes up as, whose rights? Whose rights? Is it the mother's rights? Is it society's rights? Is it the fetus rights? What is it? And then we might say, well, what's the law? Well, what law? I mean, there are different laws about abortion that have to do with when abortions can take place and under what circumstances it can take place. Is it a question of responsibility? Are there different answers, thus, in light of different situations. So he, I think, gives a very long and interesting discussion about why abortion may be the big irresolvable question in our society. Now, he says that there are a lot of other irresolvable moral issues, but they may not rise to the, to the level of the discourse, at least in this society, on abortion. He talks about speed limits. Now, we cannot agree on speed limits. Is 70 a moral, is that moral to say we have a 70-mile-an-hour speed limit, even though we know that every time you lower the speed limit by just 5 miles an hour, you actually reduce highway deaths. So why did we choose 70 over 65? Why did we choose 65 over 70 or over 60? Well, whatever happened to the good old 55? Now, is there a correct moral answer to this? Probably not. Now, the question, I think another one that's sort of hard to resolve has to do with healthcare. If we would agree that government's job, that the basic job of government, there's no other reason to have government, is in fact to lessen harms. What do you get to do as a government in terms of policy in order to lessen harms? Well, the people who think that healthcare, that the absence of healthcare increases harms a great deal to people in society, they would say, yeah, government then has a role. But then the question would be, what role? Is it the role to give people money to buy healthcare? Is it the role to have government healthcare? I mean, we simply have not been able to decide about that. Capital punishment, another big question that is a moral question that, at least in this society, because we have lots of states, Kentucky included, where the death penalty is legal. We have other states where it is not. For instance, in Michigan, that state has never had the death penalty because it was written into the Constitution of Michigan that there would be no death penalty. So that's just some discussion about irresolvable moral questions. Okay. The other thing we want to talk about today is moral rules and our particular moral rules and special duties. Now, this is from Gert's chapter 4, and it's a really important chapter because it kind of gives us the context of how moral rules actually fit into professions. Now, first of all, you've got to know, and you've got to have this knowledge about the moral rules. It just has to be part of you. It's not about memorizing a bunch of moral rules. It's about knowing them. So you've got to know them. And then you have to be able to discern, and this is one of the things that you do in this particular essay, that you're writing. You have to be able to discern what moral rules may actually be masked in a contextual way and what those moral rules might actually be. Let me give you some examples. Don't drink and drive. Okay, so that's an acceptable moral stand in this society, and not in all societies, because all societies don't have the kind of high-speed automobile travel that we do. They may not have the use of alcohol to the extent that we do. So through experience, and a lot of it is then caught in data, we know that drinking and driving is a really dangerous thing to do. So that's a contextualized moral rule, and I'm going to leave it up to you to figure out what the what the general moral rule is, okay? Don't get a blood transfusion if you are a Jehovah's Witness. What's that? What moral rule would that be that would be contextualized within a religion? What about public nudity? Is there something wrong with being naked in public? What's the big deal here? What are we, is there a moral rule beneath that? And if so, what is it? What about spanking a child? Are we allowed to spank kids in this society? You know, there are some countries in which spanking is simply illegal. It's against the law. Not in this country. Even in Kentucky, we still have school districts where you get to spank kids. What about genital mutilation? Is that ever acceptable? What about defaming religion? What if you lived in a society in which religion was really not that big a deal? Or everybody had the same religion and didn't even question what religion meant? So one of the things about this society is because we are so diverse, we try to protect people who are in minority type religions, and so it becomes illegal actually to defame a religion. What about adultery? Who says that that committing adultery is a moral problem? What if a married couple agrees that they can commit adultery? Is it still adultery? You see how you have to look beyond and try to figure out what it is that is the moral rule that may be underneath that. Now, I'm going to ask you about in our discussion online. So I need you to really think about that and kind of puzzle through it. Another topic that I just want to briefly bring up, because I know I am not going to talk a whole lot tonight, are moral ideals and how those moral ideals become moral rules for professionals. Now, remember that we have these 10 moral rules, but the last one is do your duty. Now, what do you know that your duty is unless you get it from your profession, okay? So what happens in professions is that ideals that we hold on to as a profession are things that we should do. Remember, as professionals, what our job is always to lessen harm, to make somehow the world a better place, right? Whether you're a physician or you're an attorney or whether you're a social worker, that's part of what you do. And so there are, some things that we are obliged to do from our professions, but if you're in another profession, you're not obliged to do it. And I think we talked about this before, about why it is that a layperson, someone who didn't know how to approach a burning building, would not be morally required to go into a burning building and save a child. But if you were a fire person, I guess, if you were a fireman, you'd have to go into a building because you would be morally required to do that if a building were burning, because you would know how to save a person from a burning building. But as a social worker, you know what? You really don't know how to do that. So in fact, you might make things worse if you did it. So we need to consider how ideals, which are doing things that are aspirational, doing things to make things better, are actually become the duties of a profession that then can get translated to be moral rules. You see what I mean? Okay. So, for instance, let me ask you these questions, and I'm going to ask you to answer some of them online too. But keeping professional secrets, is that a moral rule or is that a moral ideal? If it's a moral ideal and it comes from a profession and then it gets translated as your duty, what is the moral rule that underlies it? Okay? Be culturally competent. Is that morally required to be culturally competent? Do you really have to do that as a social worker? Do you have to do that as an attorney or a doctor? Or is that a special duty for social workers? Don't use inappropriate touch with a client. Is that a moral rule? If so, what is the moral rule? So we need to be able to puzzle through these special duties that we have as professionals and figure out why we want to, why we require ourselves and why we are required to abide by these moral rules. Why it would be not moral to, for instance, talk on the telephone while you're seeing a client. Why it would be not moral not to be culturally competent. These are important questions that that you need to be able to deal with. So check online for what your um, assignment is, and thank you.